Those who base their system on the tropical signs argue from the visible transformation of the nature, such as the seasons of spring and winter. On the other hand, those who base it on the constellations believe these effects inherently stem from the constellations themselves, especially in the context of talismans. However, contrary to the popular belief that the sidereal system reflects the true physical reality of the sky, it does not. First of all, look at the size of a constellation like Virgo. It's about 45 degrees. Sidereal system forces every constellation into equal 30-degree segment, which contradicts astronomical reality. Maybe this picture shows the difference better. Ultimately, the only difference between the tropical and sidereal system is the starting point of their Prespective zodiac. The tropical system defines the start of the zodiac as the vernal equinox, here, the precise moment the sun enters the intersection. The sidereal system disagrees and sets its starting point based on a fixed star, such as Spica or Samak Azal in Persian. To determine which system is truly correct from various angles, we need to examine several key aspects. The first perspective is the historical one. Perhaps we need to go back and examine what the predecessors before Hipparchus and Ptolemy really used as the basis for 12 zodiac signs. Many Persian and Muslim astronomers believe that Prophet Idris or Enoch, who is 6 generations from Adam and 2 generations before Noah, is identified as Hermes in ancient Greece. He was also called Hermes the Wise or Hermes al-Haramese or Hermes Trismegistus. He is considered humanity's first instructor, and the foundations of every science are traced back to him. Therefore, what Hermes established as the first person to teach the 12 signs to humanity must be flawless and most correct, given its divine origin. Consequently, there are only 2 probabilities. In the first scenario, when Prophet Idris or Hermes was naming the signs, he did so based on the physical constellations. This circle. This means he either uses sidereal framework, or if he used a tropical framework, the time gap between the Idris the Prophet and the period around 285 AD, the intersection point of the sidereal and tropical systems, must be around 25,635 BC. In other words, if Idris or Hermes named the signs based on the tropical system, he must have lived more than 27,000 years ago, which is highly unlikely because contradicts biblical and historical chronologies such as Torah. Consequently, from this perspective, we must conclude that Hermes the Great relied on the sidereal system, not the tropical one. Therefore, the conclusion is that the naming of the signs was entirely based on the constellations from the beginning, but divided into equal 30-degree segments. Based on this result, for seasons there exist 2 possibilities. Or they simply observed that spring, which began at the intersection of the celestial equator and ecliptic, were not defined by the tropical signs, and would say, for instance, this year's spring begins at 10 degrees of Gemini, since in ancient times, as you know, the sidereal zodiac was ahead of the tropical zodiac. Or they use heliacal rising of stars, because of the discrepancy between seasons and the sidereal computational model, they use the objective observation of the stars. Like, for example, Persian use of 4 royal stars of Persia, عین السور یا الدبران or الدبران Regulus or قلب الاسد Antares or قلب العقرب and Fomalhut or Fomalhut که ما we have in Persia. As Persian used them since 5,000 years as an indication of seasonal change. Or Egyptian use of the Cyrus and the system of the ancient Arabs, in which the benchmark for the start of the spring or rainy season, or now in Arabic, was simply the physical sighting of the rising or setting of stars like Al-Sharatain or Soraya, the Pleiades, on the horizons, without even knowing how many degrees that point measured on paper. So, based on the historical perspective, it seems that sidereal computational systems is the winner. But if we assume that sidereal system is the correct one, which exact point should be considered? Zero longitude or 0 point of Aries? In the sky there are no lines, drawings or signs including where 0 degree of Aries or 180 degree of Libra lies. As you know, the sidereal style is determined based on the fixed stars. Therefore, depending on which star is chosen as the reference point, sidereal calculation will differ, such as Lahiri or Rebati school or the Sasanian systems. Numerous sidereal computation models exist. As we know, the sidereal style is determined based on fixed stars. Therefore, depending on which star is chosen as the reference point, to construct a stellar or sidereal coordinate systems, astronomers had to choose a star as an anchor stone. Let's look at 3 highly prominent sidereal schools, such as Lahiri, Rebati, and Sasanian. Although the Sasanian system is forgotten today because most post-Islamic Iranian astronomers adopted the tropical systems and no copies of Zij Shahi or Zij Shahyar exist today. The first school, or Lahiri school, which is based on Spikar Samak Azal. Astronomers of this school looked at the sky and saw a brilliant giant star named Spikar or Samak Azal in Persian. You can see it here. They said this star is the masterpiece of the heavens. We assume this star is exactly at 180 degrees, the middle of the sky. Therefore, the starting line of the Zodiac, or the 0 point degree, must be exactly 180 degrees behind this star. The second school, or Rebati school, is the star of Rasha. Other astronomers came and said, why should we calculate based on the stars in the middle of the sky? We have found another star named Rasha, or Zeta Piscium, in the constellation of Pisces, which is exactly at the end of this constellation, somewhere here. This school has many followers in India. The third school, Sasanian with Zij Shahyari or Zij Shahi. There is a serious difference between the perspective between this system and the previous 2 schools, answering to a star versus the space clock formula. Rebati or Lahiri methods relied on an observational or stellar perspective. The Sasanian relied on a mathematical perspective. There was no need for a physical star to exist at the 0 point in the Sasanian system. They constructed a mathematical route based on the mean motion of the planets. During the reign of the Khosrow Anushirvan, the king of Iran, the king of Persia before Islam, Iranian astronomers decided to domesticate an Indian mathematical system and write the Zij Shahi. They adopted the planetary motion formulas and calibrated them with their own observation in Tisfun city of capital. The Sasanian policy was not to search the sky and say where is such and such lunar mansion, like the Zeta Piscium in Revati system. They said let's put zero there. They didn't say let's put zero there or let's use the brightest star near the Zodiac as our baseline. They imported a computational matrix from the own India, and this computational matrix aligned perfectly with Earth's seasonal calendar. After the advent of Islam, astronomers like Mashallah, Yahudi, and Novakht continued to use the Zij Shahi and the sidereal system based on the Sasanian Ayana Shah. However, the majority of post-Islamic Iranian astronomers such as Abu Mashar, Biruni, or Negrizi and Kushyar ibn Loban and etc. followed Ptolemy and set the intersection of the ecliptic and the celestial equator, the vertical equinox, as the baseline to remain safe from these sidereal complications. Furthermore, this approach offered the advantage of being based on the seasonal changes, making it completely tangible for humans living on Earth, the tropical system. The second perspective can be astrological election. As a very important religious recommendation heavily emphasized in Islam, there is the concept of moon in Scorpio or Qamar dar Aqrab in Persian, particularly advising against marriage, conceiving a child, traveling, etc. The majority of post-Islamic Persian astronomers, most of whom were Shia Muslim, paid immense attention to this matter. However, a major issue is that during the era of Shia Imams, descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, when the concept of the moon in Scorpio was propagated, the discrepancy between the tropical and sidereal systems were only about 6 degrees, as you can see here. I can change and you will see the difference. Because it was not highly noticeable, the Shia of that time didn't ask precisely whether this caution applied to the days when the moon is in the tropical sign of Scorpio, the sidereal sign, or even the actual visual entry of the moon into the constellation of Scorpio, like we had in this picture, the differences. Or even if they did ask, it was not recorded in the text. Since it is probable that when the Shia Imams addressed the general public, the visual placement of the moon within the constellation was the baseline, my personal belief is that one can treat the moon's presence in the constellation of Scorpio, which is closer to the sidereal system, as the primary baseline, while cautiously taking the tropical moon in the Scorpio into account as well. Of course, in Iran, given the legacy of the post-Islamic Persian astronomers who only considered the tropical system valid, most people solely check the tropical calendar, while a small minority observe both the sidereal and tropical in Scorpio simultaneously. But the third perspective, and most important one, empirical experience. How pleasant it would be if the touchstone of the experience were brought into play. It is worth noting that in Iran history during the 12th century AD, highly famous septenary conjunction, conjunction of 7 planets occurred. Ambari, the great astrologer, and many astronomers of that era predicted a catastrophic, destructive storms. They formulated their interpretation based on the said conjunction occurring at the beginning of the sign Libra in the tropical system. However, no such a storm occurred, and they faced the wrath of the king. Yet in the sidereal system, this conjunction occurred in the sign of Virgo. Let's me see if I have the uh, conjunctions. No, I didn't have, unfortunately. Anyway, a planetary conjunction in Virgo signifies the death and downfall of the rulers, but actually followed the occurrence of this septenary conjunction was the rise of Genghis Khan and the Mongol invasion of Iran. Although I do not have access to a statistical database, based on my personal observation, I have noticed that the traffic accidents are significantly higher on days when the moon in the sidereal Scorpio. Like now, today is the moon in Scorpio in the sidereal system, everywhere of the world, every place in the world. Furthermore, a friend of mine who works in a marriage registry office noted that the majority of divorces belonged to the marriages whose wedding contracts were signed when the moon was in the sidereal Scorpio. On another note, during the total lunar eclipse of the September 7, 2025, I mean the 16 شهریور 1404 in Persian calendar, I had it here, fortunately. The Mumtaz star in Persian astrology in the sidereal system was Saturn and Mars. Which fell under an eclipse in Aquarius, as you can see here, with Saturn itself in the Pisces and Mars in Virgo. In contrast, in the tropical system, you can see here, place Jupiter in Libra and categorize it as the conjunction in Pisces. Looking at the nature of the events that unfolded, I observed that they were predominantly Saturnian in character, such as the severe price hikes in products like rice in Iran. As a personal reflection, if I were to speak from my personal experiences, I only consider myself rather a student in the field of mundane astrology. So I was able to track and identify Iran's two recent military conflicts with the Israel and the US solely using the tropical system. It was impossible using the sidereal system, unfortunately. However, regarding the natal chart, the natal astrology, although I'm truly not an expert in this domain, I have not yet been able to reach a definitive conclusion between tropical and sidereal. As for the domain of electional astrology, since all Persian astrologists and all the Persian astrology books like the Lawaihul Qamar, the most famous electional Persian astrology book, are based on the tropical system. I have exclusively used the tropical system, except for the concept of the moon in Scorpio, which is heavily emphasized in Shia school, where I look at the tropical, sidereal, and especially the actual constellation itself. My personal opinion is that the influence of the constellations is undeniably real, but this does not mean when we name the 12 structural signs based on the constellations, we should recognize its inherent value. For instance, during the various periods of history, you can see that The constellation of Libra was known as the Close of Scorpion. After all, each sign has been a fixed 30 degrees from the beginning, whereas constellations vary drastically in size. Thank you for attention. See you next.